For the next half hour, our speaker is a research fellow from the Forethought Foundation for Global Priorities Research, and he will present an introduction to long-termism and share new research on the topic. Welcome on stage, Aron Vallinder.
Thank you. It's great to be here. So today I will be presenting the case for long-termism. And effective altruism starts with a simple question. How can we do the most good? But as I'm sure you all know, this simple question turns out to be very difficult to answer. It requires us to deal with several thorny empirical and moral issues. And in my talk today, I will propose one answer to this question and explore some consequences of that answer. So my answer is that we can do the most good by focusing our efforts on the long-term future. Now, when political pundits take a long-term view, they typically have in mind something like 5 or 10 years into the future. I instead have in mind something like 100 or 1,000 years into the future, or perhaps even longer. And so by long-termism, I mean the idea that the most important aspect of what we do today is how our actions affect the long-term future. And in the first part of this talk, I will give some reasons for why I think the long-term future is so important. And in the second part, I will describe some of the things that we can do today that I think look promising from this long-termist perspective. So first of all, why long-termism? Why should we focus on the long term rather than the short term? As effective altruists, we don't think that someone's location in space is relevant for whether or not we should help them. If the same amount of money allows you to do more good in the developing world than in your home country, then you should give it to the developing world. And by the same token, we shouldn't think that someone's location in time is a morally relevant consideration. The fact that someone's suffering takes place in the distant future doesn't make it any less real. And so therefore, again, if the same amount of resources allow you to do more good by focusing on the distant future than on the present, then you should use it to help those in the distant future. Now, to start thinking about long-termism, I find it helpful to consider the following thought experiment, which many of you may probably be familiar with. So the philosopher Derek Parfit asks us to compare 3 possible outcomes. First, world peace. Everyone's happy and enjoying their lives. Second, a nuclear war that destroys 99% of humankind. Third, a nuclear war that destroys 100% of humankind. Now, if we were to rank these outcomes, it's obvious how things would go. World peace is better than a nuclear war that eradicates 99% of humanity, which in turn is better than a nuclear war that eradicates 100% of humanity. But Parfit asks us to consider a more interesting question, namely which difference is bigger, between the first and the second outcome, or between the second and the third outcome. If we just consider the number of immediate deaths, then it's clear that the first difference is bigger. That difference is roughly 6.93 billion lives, whereas the second one is only a difference of about 70 million lives. But if 100% of humanity is wiped out, that means that all future potential is lost. That would be the end of the human adventure. And so for this reason, Parfit thinks that the second difference is biggest. But what is it exactly that would be lost if the human adventure came to an end? What is the future that we could miss out on? Well, first of all, the future could be very big. How big exactly? Let's consider the human adventure so far. We've been around for about 200,000 years or so, depending a bit on how you count. And compared to the timescales that we're used to thinking about, this is, of course, a very, very long time. But what if we look farther ahead? How long could humanity exist for? Well, here's one way of thinking about it. So the typical mammalian species has a lifespan of about 2 million years. So if humanity is typical, that would mean we have about 90% of our time left. But of course, humanity is a pretty remarkable species, and there's no reason to think that we're typical. We have 1,000 times the biomass of any other large animal that has ever lived, and we inhabit a wider range of diverse environments than any other large animal does. Perhaps more importantly, we have the technology to avoid what would be extinction-level events from any other species, including the power to detect and deflect asteroids. And so here we see that the Earth will become uninhabitable in about 500 million years. And this means that if we manage to hang in there, we may only have seen the very beginning of the human adventure, the first 0.04%. If we assume that there's a 10% chance that civilization lasts until Earth becomes uninhabitable, and that 10 billion people will exist for each century during that time, then in expectation, the future will contain 500,000 more people than are alive today. But if anything, these numbers might be conservative. In principle, the planet could support a much larger population than 10 billion per century. And of course, if we manage to leave the solar system and settle the stars, we could have a much longer future still. Secondly, not only is the future very big, but it could also be very good. According to very many different measures, for most people, life has been getting significantly better over the past couple of 100 years. And there's no reason to think that this can continue into the future. Let's have a look at some trends. So first of all, life expectancy has been increasing dramatically over the last few hundred years. As you can see here, since the year 1800, it has more than doubled from just under 40 years to just over 80 years. Similarly, the percentage of world population not in extreme poverty has also been increasing dramatically. From just under 10% in 1850, it has now reached over 90%. And in many ways, we have also become freer over time. Here you can see the percentage of the number of countries that have decriminalized homosexuality. And in the year 1800, as you can see, that was just under 5% of all countries, whereas now it's almost reached 90%. Fourth, the number of democracies have been rising steadily, reaching almost 90% of the world's countries today. Of course, there's nothing inevitable about these trends. And if we don't play our cards right, we could see any one of them reversing. But what I think the trends do illustrate is that progress is possible, and that if things go well, the future could be very good indeed. The future is potentially big, potentially good, but it's also very neglected. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, first of all, future generations are voiceless. They don't get to have a say in the democratic decisions that we make today, even though they are significantly impacted by those decisions. And insofar as people don't vote with the long-term future in mind, we should expect current policies to be fairly short-term oriented. Now, there are some proposals for how to do political representation of future generations that I'm excited about. And if you find this topic interesting, I would really recommend you check out Signe Savien's talk tomorrow, which will go into this in more detail. But in addition to political barriers, there are also psychological reasons why the long-term future is neglected. Stefan Schubert, who spoke to us earlier today about moral aspirations and psychological limitations, has done some fascinating research on this topic. And I will just mention a few points here. So first of all, we tend to discount the future. That is, we tend to think that future harms and benefits count for less simply because they're more distant in the future. And the more distant they are, the less they count for. Now, there are some good reasons to discount the future. For example, the farther into the future we look, the more uncertain we typically become about what the effects of our actions might be. But from a purely moral perspective, the mere fact that something occurs in the future rather than the present does not make it any less valuable. Second, it's hard for us to imagine very far into the future. One study actually found that when people hear the word future, on average, they think about 15 years from now. And after 20 years, people's ability to imagine the future more or less goes dark. Third, and relatedly, it's very hard for us to empathize with future people. We can't interact with them, and we can't see the effects our actions have on them. But there's an upside to this too, which is that few people care about the future, but those who do can therefore expect to have a disproportionate impact. In particular, it means that we have a superpower, patience. Now, at this point, you might think, sure, it would be great if we could do anything to affect the long-term future. But how could we possibly hope to have influence over such long timescales? Isn't anything we do likely to just wash out over time? Or even if it doesn't wash out over time, aren't we just going to be clueless about whether our actions will actually have a positive or a negative effect? I'll present 3 suggestions for what a long-termist could do. Most of all, these are intended as showing that it is possible to have influence over such long timescales, even though I expect that future research will come up with even more promising interventions. So first of all, the first way of benefiting the future is to make sure that it actually comes about. If humanity goes extinct, there wouldn't be any long-term future. And so anything we do to decrease the risk of human extinction looks potentially very promising from a long-termist perspective. Now, this is probably the long-termist intervention which has so far received the most attention from the effective altruist community, and I won't go into it in much detail, especially as it's covered in this conference a lot. So tomorrow, Hayden Belfield will tell us why climate change constitutes an existential risk. Cassidy Nelson told us earlier about biological risks. And tomorrow, Marcus Anderjung will tell us about risks from artificial intelligence. And so anything we can do to mitigate these and other extinction risks look potentially very promising for a long-termist. For my next point, let us first take a brief historical detour to 5th and 4th century BCE China. On your left is Mozi, founder of Mohism, which was a school of thought or philosophy that was highly influential at the time and, in fact, resembles effective altruism in some striking ways. So the Mohists were the world's first consequentialists. They emphasized impartial caring over attachments to one's family, city, or state. And Mozi and his early followers lived during the Warring States era in China. At this time, China was divided into many smaller states that were more or less constantly at war with one another. And troubled by all of this warfare, the Mohists, many Mohists specialized in defensive technology, which they basically provided for free or for a very low cost to cities and states. Perhaps an early example of what Nick Bostrom calls differential technological development. But when China was unified, the Mohists came to lose a lot of their influence. And what's more, the Mohist way of life gradually came to be seen as alien and unappealing. Their obsession with efficiency and their distaste for ritual and music, which they saw as wasteful, were both strongly counter to the traditional Chinese way of life. And I'll let you draw the conclusions yourself about EA from this. Now, the man on your right will be more familiar. Confucius, founder of Confucianism. Unlike Mohism, Confucianism emphasizes family and social harmony. And when Mohism faded away into irrelevance, Confucianism instead became the official ideology of the Chinese state and remained so for over 2 millennia. Now, the point of this example is to illustrate that institutions can have influence over very long time frames. So the second thing a long-termist could do is try to influence some of these long-lasting institutions. And I use the word institution fairly broadly here, so it can include religions, nations, legal systems, voting systems, and so forth. To give you some more examples of the long-lasting influence of institutions, consider that the legal systems of many Western European countries and their former colonies are heavily influenced by Roman law. And political differences between countries are often driven by the nature of their constitutions. For example, US gun laws are heavily influenced by a constitution written 250 years ago. For another example, most of the most influential religions today were also the most influential religions in the year 1000. Now, what does this mean in practice? How should we influence institutions? One example is of an organization working in this space is the Center for Election Science, a US-based nonprofit which advocates voting system reform. Voting experts agree that plurality voting, whereby voters only get to choose one candidate, is one of the very worst voting methods available. And yet, this is the most widely used one as well. Alternative voting methods, such as approval voting, which is what the Center for Election Science advocates, whereby you vote for as many candidates as you want, leads to much greater voter satisfaction. And so any voting system that elects better candidates looks potentially very promising from a long-termist perspective. Another thing we could do in this space is develop stronger international governance institutions, or even a world government. This could happen through a variety of means. It could be developed gradually out of existing international institutions like the UN, or it could be put in place in the aftermath of a new world war, just like UN and other organizations were put in place after World War II, or it could come about as the result of one country coming to dominate economically. Given that institutions can last for such a long time, influencing them in a positive direction is also something that looks potentially very good from a long-termist perspective. Now, the third thing a long-termist could do is try to influence what I call lock-in technologies. Some technological developments have the feature that once they're adopted, they tend to be locked in. That is, there's some mechanism that maintains their use even if people come to prefer some alternative technology that could have been adopted. So the classic example of this is the QWERTY keyboard. We now know that the alternative Dvorak layout facilitates faster typing, but of course there would be substantial switching costs if everyone using the QWERTY keyboard today were to switch to the Dvorak, and so we're locked in with the QWERTY keyboard. Now, for any such lock-in technology, anything we could do to influence which version of the technology gets locked in could potentially have effects for a very long time into the future. Of course, the QWERTY example is fairly trivial, but one of the more extreme and arguably compelling examples today is the development of artificial general intelligence. It's becoming increasingly plausible that this will be developed in the next couple of centuries, perhaps, and that once it's developed, the resulting artificial agent or agents will come to shape much of the future after that point. And so once that has happened, we may have little chance to influence which particular direction this will go in. But during the time at which it is being developed, there are measures we can take to influence the path that this technology goes down, such as by funding AI safety research or AI governance research. So, in summary, what should a long-termist do? Here are 3 examples. Reduce the risk of human extinction, improve and develop institutions, and influence lock-in technologies. But these are just some very early thoughts, and much more research is needed. The things I've suggested are just some tentative current best guesses, and most of all, they're intended as proof of concept of the idea that we can, in fact, have influence over long timescales. But the Longtermism project is really just getting started, and I think it's overwhelmingly likely that we'll find new interventions that lead to even better outcomes. And so this means that at the moment, actually the best thing you could do as a long-termist is more research into how we can shape the long-term future. And this will be a multidisciplinary research project where lots of different disciplines can contribute. For example, philosophy can help us answer the question of which moral views endorses long-termism, what happens if we're acting under moral uncertainty. Economics can tell us about how to boost economic growth, which is another way of shaping the long-term future. And it can also tell us how we should trade off increased economic growth versus the associated risks from new technology. History can help us see what to learn from past events with long-run influence. Psychology can answer questions about how to make people more motivated to care about the distant future. Political science can tell us how to build more long-term oriented institutions, etc. I'm sure there are lots of other disciplines that have relevant insights to contribute here. And if you're a researcher, I hope you'll join me in this long-termist project. Thank you very much.